Well, Sheldon, thank you so much for setting this up. When I first contacted you, I didn't even think that this would be possible, but this is great to be able to get a bit more in-depth understanding about this pathway. And I contacted you because I'm interested in counseling. I'm looking for the pathway into that career. And there seems to be a lot of chatter, a lot of a lot of information out in the internet. And I really was looking for someone who could kind of synthesize all of this and make it make sense. So I was hoping I could just ask you a few questions that come to mind for me. And if there's anything else that I should know or other people should know in this position who are exploring this career, that would be great to pursue that.
Sounds good. The main focus of our counseling program is on the core competencies.
Okay.
And I'll explain what that is.
Great.
The core competencies were started in 1998 by the BC Association of Clinical Counselors. And this is a group that I'm a member of. I'm one of the founding members. This was started in a meeting of the legislative committee of that association, which I was part of. And we decided that we are going to create some what's called core competencies. What are the essential entry-level requirements that every counselor should know before they start counseling or professionally? There were about, at that time, about 280 different core competencies, different specific skills that that person should have. Over the years, that's been developed. And it's gone through many, many revisions, and it still serves as a model across Canada. Anytime legislation is considered in counseling, the core competencies have been used in most provinces that have legislation. So our course, and I should mention ACCT, which is the Association of Cooperative Counseling Therapists, their requirements to become a registered therapeutic counselor is based on those core competencies. So what happened is once those core competencies came into effect, not legally, because there is no legislation around counseling, but came into effect as a requirement by most counseling associations, then all the schools sort of followed suit. And so we created our counseling program based on those core competencies. And Diane Auld, our head instructor, is the one who put it together pretty much from scratch.
Okay, so we've started exploring some of these bodies or associations, and I think that causes some confusion for people in understanding how they all fit together. And you've started to give some history around the BCACC and the other association, ACCT. And I also heard some acronyms out there. So the RTC, so the Registered Therapeutic Counselor, and I understand that registered clinical counselors are underneath the BCACC. Are you able to parse some of that out for me and just give me an overview of why are there two different designations? What do they mean?
It can be a confusing mess. It's not done purposely, but it's done because there is no legislation. So first thing to explain that, the most important thing is to realize that right now there is no legislation in most provinces in Canada except for 4. So those 4 relating to counseling. Those 4 are Ontario, Nova Scotia, PEI, and Quebec. The others don't have legislation or are considering legislation. So things might change in the future, which we'll get to. But to explain the different associations, well, it sort of makes sense that if you don't have a regulatory body, a legal body, then you're going to have associations come up that set standards for its own members. And they're saying, look, in lieu of legislation, of regulation, we're going to set our own standards. And so what you have is a bunch of different associations setting their own standards and giving their own titles. The biggest association in BC is the BCACC, BC Association of Clinical Counselors. It has about 6,000 members right now. ACCT is another association, Association of Cooperative Counseling Therapists. I think at last count, there were about 800. I'm not absolutely positive, but I think it's around that. Then you have the CPCA, which is the Canadian Professional Counselors Association. Again, I'm guessing here, but I think it might be around 400 members.
Yeah.
Those two associations used to be the same associations.
Oh.
And a number of years ago, they split. So these and other associations set their own standards, become nonprofit professional associations, and create their own titles. The titles are valid within those associations. Outside of those particular associations, yes, the titles, I'm going to rephrase that, the titles are valid, but from a technical view, from a legal point of view, they're not legal. I want to be very clear on that. There's no legal definition, is what I'm trying to say. Such as registered nurse, registered psychologist, physician, these all have legal titles and legal scope of practice. The counseling associations do not. So they have no ability to regulate people practicing outside of their association. They can only oversee and disseminate rules to their own members. So the problem is pretty obvious. Someone can easily leave an association if they're practicing unethically and still practice. And then the only recourse there is to go to legal route. So that's where we're at right now.
I think the question that comes to mind for me, after hearing that there's these separate groups, separate associations, and right now it's really within their own space that these titles really matter, is, well, what is the advantage of going with one or the other? And if there is insight into what the BC government is going to do, how should that factor into people's decisions around their pathway?
Okay, that's a two-parter.
Yes, it is.
Okay, so what's the advantage of joining any of these associations? ACCT, getting a designation of registered therapeutic counselor is a good thing. Even though it's not a regulatory body, people looking for counselors still look for that. It still has meaning to them. And it's popular enough people know about it to make it attractive if someone's looking for a therapist. You could say the same about RCC. To be an RCC, you need a master's right now. You could say the same thing about RPC, which is registered professional counselor with the other group. There is a big advantage there as opposed to going out without any letters and trying to open a practice. Now, the other big thing is that you get partial coverage for your clients under extended medical plans. So ACCT has agreements with a number of insurance companies. Their members get partial coverage for their clients. An educated guess on that is probably, if you were an RTC, your clients, about 35% of your clients would be covered by extended medical plans. And the reason there's no exact number is because there's so many different plans and every plan has different criteria. So literally impossible to figure that out. But about 35%. RCCs probably get about 50% coverage. RPCs probably about the same as ACCT.
So there's no one designation that gives you full coverage, because I think sometimes there's a conception that you have to have a certain area in order to be able to provide services and for most of your clients to get covered. But what I'm hearing, neither of these provide full coverage for everyone.
No, you won't see that
Okay.
in any profession. It's almost always partial, unless you're under the BC medical plan. Eventually, if there is legislation in the future and you're a member of a regulatory college, all of that changes. All the current associations will no longer have the same role. Literally overnight. Once it's announced, once it's done, and these are always provincial, they're never federal. So once it's done and you have a regulatory college, then ACCT no longer gives out certificates or certifications of any type, and neither does any other association. Becomes the job of the regulatory body.
Okay.
And then what you will have is a scope of practice that's defined, and your title would be part of a legal entity.
So I guess one of the questions I have around that is, as you're making a decision to go into this area, knowing that things may change in the future, how do we plan for that? Is there anything that we should be mindful of in planning for that or deciding the types of programs we go into?
Knowledge is power. So it's important to stay up on the changes, simply because it is moving. It's not standing still. I'll reiterate again that it is provincial. Every province does its own thing. Just because one province does one thing doesn't mean the other province will do the same thing. So what we do is make educated guesses. So we have FACT BC. Are you familiar with that?
Vaguely.
Okay. FACT BC, I'm on the board of FACT BC. FACT BC is sort of when I talked about those original meetings with the BC government, over the years, these groups changed and kept meeting with the government. And eventually it became FACT BC, which represents, I think it's about 12 associations, counselor associations in BC. They used to represent BCACC as well, and they've since split from FACT BC. And we probably should talk about Bill 36.
Okay.
So about 9 months ago, Bill 36 was introduced and passed by the BC government. And what Bill 36 basically said is that they're going to take the 20 existing health colleges in BC. So we're talking about, and when I say college, it's a regulatory college.
Right.
They're going to take them and create two groups. And they're going to do this, and all of those 20 will be in either one of those groups. This doesn't concern the counselors because we don't have regulation. This is only groups with current regulation. And so they're not even sure what they're going to call the different groups yet. They expect to be finished that process by June 2024. What they're going to do from there is start the process of looking at the counselors and where to put them and within those two groups. They'll go in one group or the other. How it's going to look, not even the government knows right now. Recently, they came out with a statement that even in June 2024, when this is supposed to be finished, how often does the government actually meet the date they say they're going to finish it by? But supposedly on June 2024, they're going to start looking at the counselors. And they expect that to take about 1.75 to 2 years just to go through that process. Once they go through that process, we'll obviously start to have a better idea of what the intention is and what they see it happening there. My bet is that it's probably going to take another year or two to actually put something into effect and get it passed relating to counseling. Now, in saying that, I just want to mention that in 2010 and 2014, the BC government stated very clearly that the counselors were next in line to be regulated. And this was a public statement. I think in 2010, there was a group of technicians that they wanted to regulate first. And I can't remember specifically what they did, but they told the counselors at the time that we were next in line. Those technicians are still yet to be regulated. And obviously the counselors aren't anywhere close right now. In 2014, the BC government announced the same thing, and nothing happened. My feeling at this point is that it would not surprise me if it was dropped and they didn't go forward with it, because it is not a priority right now. And what you're looking at is possibly an election or two, maybe a few different health ministers by then. So we really don't know. All we can do is speculate based on past experience and what other provinces have done.
I wonder if there's any other big pieces of advice, maybe just one piece of advice you would give to people who are considering this path and are still at a crossroads of making that step to go forward.
Well, right now, one of the main areas that people are concerned with, possibly number one right now in Canada, is future possible legislation. And nobody likes uncertainty. So it can be a bit frustrating to hear that, yeah, we don't really know how it's going to look in the end. But that's the reality. I guess that's part of counseling too. It's just dealing with the reality of things. The good news, the way I interpret it, and it's only my interpretation at this point based on past experience. As I said before, I think there's a good chance, I'm just going to talk about BC now, but I think there's a good chance that BC it wouldn't surprise me if they didn't go forward with it. It just sort of disappeared. And you didn't hear about Bill 36 anymore. They just restructured the colleges and left it at that. But if we take a scenario where that's not the case, you're looking at June 2024 at the soonest that they'll be ready to even consider the counselors. Then they have to compile a lot of information. So they're going to continue with their task force in the information gathering phase. That's going to take, on their own admission, 1.75 to 2 years to even start that process of knowing what they're going to do. And even at that point, sometime after that, they're going to have a grandfathering period. A grandfathering period typically is 2 to 3 years. It gives a whole lot of student counselors an ability to get into a regulatory college before the final requirements. So now we're looking at 2027. Who knows what things are going to look like that? I could be wrong. You could have a new health minister tomorrow morning. You could have a new government in a few months with their own ideas. We have no control over that, but we can make educated guesses. And that's basically what we're doing. By the way, Fact BC is well worth visiting because all of the current information is there.
Mm.
Anything new that's happening, it's up there. We also keep our students as up to date as possible. So anytime news comes in, everybody knows about it. There are certain things you can do to safeguard yourself in the event that there will be future legislation sometime. And when I say there will be, even if there is, if we look at the worst case scenario, even if they require a master's degree,
Mhm.
which I don't think they will, but even if they do in 2027 or 28,
Mhm.
anybody who's going through the training from now until a few years from now is going to easily get into the new college,
Mm.
the potential new college,
Mm.
simply through the grandfathering period. Again, it's not written in stone, but I'm basing that on what's the typical procedure pretty much worldwide.
Mm.
There's always a grandfathering period.
Mm.
Legally, I think they even have to do it, but I'm not positive about that. But there has to be a transition.
Mm.
They can't they can't wake up tomorrow morning and say, okay, everybody needs a master's degree. That's not going to happen. If they do get to that point, my feeling is that it's more likely that they're going to have a two-tier system where the first tier will be master's level and the second tier will be a licensing system of the rest of the counselors. That's speculation on my part. It's just
Mhm.
based on what I feel at this point. Every province is different. Every province does their own thing. Most provinces don't have legislation and won't have for a long time. So if you were going to practice and you were going to practice in Ontario, you wouldn't be able to without a master's degree right now. But if you registered your proprietorship, your practice in Saskatchewan,
Mhm.
and you only saw clients online, then as far as I know, you're under Saskatchewan jurisdiction,
Oh, interesting.
not Ontario's. I'm not a lawyer. Okay, I don't know that 100%, but it seems pretty reasonable to me that that would be the case.
Mhm.
Only if you saw clients on site in Ontario would you have to be a member of the regulatory college. Called the free trade agreement. And what it states, it's a federal law, and what it states is if you're a member of a regulatory college in any province in Canada in a particular profession, and you want to practice that profession in another province anywhere in Canada, then you should be able to do so legally. It is possible, and I did look this up, that the individual province you want to practice in, let's say you want to practice in Ontario, it is possible the Ontario government or their college could say, well, you can practice, but you need to get further training.
Mm.
So
Mhm.
they could do that. Whether it stands up or not, I'm not sure. Okay. But the Canadian Free Trade Agreement, it's easy to look up, and it's a very simple few lines. And it states very clearly that once you're a member of a regulatory college, you can practice elsewhere. There's a number of finer points when you get into it, I think are important for people to know. You know, you have to be a bit of a policy wonk to really get into this stuff. But the more information you have, the better position you're in to make choices. And what happens too often is people make choices without all the information.
I think what's certainly standing out for me is that there is going to be some uncertainty over the next couple of years, probably for going into counseling and being able to help other people with that uncertainty. We need to use those skills in ourselves to kind of manage that personally. But then in deciding around a program, not letting that uncertainty dictate the path you take. Really focusing on what is the program like? What does that mean for you? Is it a good fit for you? Are you going to learn what you want to learn? Are you going to feel confident afterwards? And allow that kind of guide your pathway. And that may look different for different people. But what I'm really taking away is that there are actually a good number of options here, and really allow that personal guidance to kind of direct your path, not all the uncertainty that's around, which is creating a lot of chatter.
When I started the school, I had more barriers to starting that school on a provincial level than anything I could have imagined. When we started our school in 1986, there was one little office in New West, which was run by one person who was the complete private training institute's office.
Wow.
That was it, one person.
Wow.
He was responsible for all schools, all private schools, post-secondary private schools. And at the time, we had to put up a $150,000 bond just to get the school started. Now, I'm not going to go into the details of how we went about doing this. His name was Ozzy, very nice guy, and we got to know him. And one of the things we had to do as well is we had to get letters from people that were known in the field to support us. And we had our letters, and then the BC Psych Association started writing letters to Ozzy saying, we don't want the school registered. They're a bunch of hypnotists. They're not psychologists. You know, they shouldn't be allowed to do anything. Ozzy said, yeah, you know, I got these letters from the BC Psych Association, but I got even more letters from psychologists who support the school. We went back and forth quite a bit. We got our bond reduced, we got ourselves registered, and we started. So when we talk about barriers like this, things change. And I think the important part of that is, hopefully, I'm hoping most counselors are a little bit of risk takers. Because that's part of, in my view, my personal view, what you want to impart to clients. Quite often clients are very involved in themselves, and there's a lot of fear around putting what they really want out there, rather than the crazy things I did to get the school to where it is now. We wouldn't be here. We wouldn't exist. We would have went out in 1992. We would have been gone, because every time the agency PTIB got bigger, PTIB now is called different things over the years. Every time it got bigger and bigger and bigger, we had more rules. And every time we would encounter something that maybe we couldn't meet, and we always figured it out. I'm using that as an analogy for a student that's looking at this and going, well, is it too much of a risk? Should I just pay the money and go the MA route, even if I want to learn certain things that doesn't offer me? You know, and that's a decision. But my personal view is counseling is about risk.
I really appreciate that. Thank you for imparting, you know, that experience, but also how that relates to people actually just making this decision to go forward. So yeah, thank you. Thank you, Sheldon.